Welcome to the Burn Up Podcast, where we discuss all things agile software development and delivery.
We will be giving you an honest take on tools and techniques. We'll share our experiences, debunk myth, and hopefully provide needed inspiration.
Hi, I'm Todd Anderson, Consultant Delivery Manager. I've done just about every job in IT, from tech support, programmer, network security, project and program management. I can't say I've done everything, but I've seen a lot.
And I'm Marcel Bridge, digital consultant, business analyst and product owner. I've worked in digital before this even had a name, and since have been quite a bit around the block. And this is my way of giving back to the industry.
So sit back, relax, and settle in for this week's episode. A few announcements before we get started with today's episode. First off is how to best get in touch with us, which is by going to our webpage at burnupmedia.com. There you'll find links to our Twitter feed, which is @burnupmedia, and our LinkedIn page. You'll also find links to all the major players to subscribe to the podcast. If you want to leave comments on any specific episode, please click on that episode on our webpage and fill in the form at the bottom of the page. We've also added chapters to all of our podcasts, so if you have a player that supports chapters, you can skip the intro and go straight to the podcast. If not, our intro is about 1 minute and 5 seconds long, so just skip ahead a minute and start listening. So please do subscribe, write reviews, give us feedback, and also please share it via Twitter or company message boards, or send it to anybody you think might be interested. Thank you so much, and here's today's episode. All right, today we're going to talk about kicking off a new series, our first series really on this podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to talk about roles and composition of delivery teams. So the idea here is we're going to have a series of podcasts sort of deep diving into specific roles that you usually find on a delivery team. And today's sort of an overview kickoff episode where we might just generally go through what roles you might find on a team, and kind of like also how the composition of a team as far as like how many of them you find on a team, you know, what they do, that sort of thing.
Exactly, and then we'll do individual episodes about each role where we explain like why the role is important, what good looks like, maybe discuss a little bit how you get into the roles and why, you know, why the role is there in the first place.
Yeah, and we'll bring people who actually perform those roles in. So obviously you and I can cover delivery management and business analysis and that sort of thing. But, you know, stuff like tech leads, we'll bring in tech leads.
We'll have colleagues who know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
So let's get started here. So from the top, so to speak, is kind of you have an engagement manager or maybe an account manager they might be known as. They're the type of people that might take it over from the sales team at a consultancy, and they manage the account all the way through. So
the key client relationship, I would say. They're quite often in control of the financials as well. And they're ultimately, I guess, responsible for making the client happy. I mean, the entire team is, but they're the first point of contact.
They're the highest point of escalation, really.
Correct.
They're the ones that's butts are on the line if the engagement doesn't go well, right? So like you say, they probably manage the budget. They look at sort of the overall team makeup, and it's a very interactive role, right? They're working with all the other team members to make sure things are staying on track.
They're usually the counterpart of the client sponsor.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. They'll definitely be working at that executive level.
Correct.
They may or may not be working day in, day out on the thing. They might dip in actually from time to time, or they might be more hands-on from sometimes, you know, during crunch times or some risky moments. So
that's actually an interesting point. So we have on some of our projects that are very needy, we have full-time engagement managers, and then other projects that are maybe not that big, not that complicated, not that complex, that don't need that much attention. An engagement manager may have multiple clients, multiple projects.
Right.
Yep.
So moving on to the next role. So this is kind of the role that I typically play. So it's a delivery lead, program manager, project manager, scrum master. This is kind of a focus on delivery, right? So I would say on this, program manager would sort of be your managing entire program. So they
multiple projects, right?
More about
streams of work.
More about the governance, right?
Yeah.
And there might be a number of project manager or delivery leads underneath that.
Yeah.
But the idea of program manager is much more a higher level, looking at how the whole program of work comes together, all the dependencies, bringing all that stuff together. A project manager is probably maybe more working more at the level of a team, trying to make sure that that team is delivering, managing risks and blockers at that lower level. And then Scrum Master is something kind of altogether different. The Scrum Master is really sort of hyper-focused on the day-to-day running of a team and making sure the team is, pushing stories through and that sort of thing. A lot of times that Scrum Master might be a project manager or delivery lead, but also you might see business analysts sort of drifting into doing that sort of work because they're kind of hands-on there day-to-day with the team. I think Scrum Masters are really about driving delivery day-to-day, making sure that...
Facilitation, right?
Facilitation,
unblocking,
running stand-ups, that sort of thing, making sure stories keep moving through the wall.
I mean, I have seen teams where there was no Scrum Master specifically dedicated, but the role just emerged and maybe even rotated around the team members, whereas I think of any program team of size, you will definitely want a dedicated delivery lead, program manager, project manager.
Yeah, and whereas you probably only have one engagement account manager on a project, you probably only have one program manager in a program, obviously. Project managers, you might have a lot of them, and Scrum Masters, you should have probably at least one per team. Right?
Correct.
And also, I do want to say Scrum Master is kind of a general term too, no matter what kind of agile methodology, even if you're doing lean or something like that, you kind of still say Scrum Master. That's pretty interchangeable.
That's a pretty good point, yeah.
So I just want to make sure that people don't get confused that you say Scrum Master, that only means Scrum. But we'll go more in depth in that when we do the deep dive on that. So next up is your cup of tea.
So yeah, I'm a business analyst, product person, product owner, and this role is all about making sense of what the client's needs are, what they are expecting, what their goals are, and then communicating that to the team and making sure that what the team delivers is adding ultimately value. And the role of the business analyst and the product owner, they're kind of along a spectrum. The product owner is more focused on user needs, business needs, whereas the business analyst is more focused on the nitty-gritty of defining a solution. But ultimately, it's a role that's to do with analysis and understanding client and business needs and then helping the team to deliver in that direction. Your counterpart on the client side are either product owners, product managers, or quite often they're salespeople or possibly just users directly that are the counterparts that provide you with their needs and requirements.
At minimum, you have one of these usually on a delivery team, but you might have many of them depending on how many developers you have to feed with work. It's really about making sure there's enough people, analysts, to feed work to the team.
Yeah, it's all to do with, as you say, with bandwidth.
Okay, let's go to the next one, which I think, again, is probably more aligned with the product owner analysis phase.
Exactly. Usually you, as a business analyst, product person, you kind of pair with user experience service designers and visual designers. So these are the guys that design the solution from a user perspective in great detail. So they champion the user, they understand what the user needs in terms of interacting with the product, and they will express this in terms of wireframes, in terms of visual designs, they apply branding. Their counterpart is quite often the marketing branding department on the client side, and they are also the guys who would do user research, user testing. I mean, sometimes these roles are split out, and then there are user testing roles or market research roles. So we'll club this all together under user experience and CX design. And again, dependent on the size of your project, I've worked on projects where we had 5 to 6 user experience designers and visual designers. Sometimes just one might suffice. It depends a little bit on how...
Yeah, same with me. Like we had a project where we had a whole team of design because it was really a certain new and more complex sort of proposition that we were going to users with. So we had to do, we had weekly testing, user testing where we actually went to a lab, observed, came back with some findings that ultimately ended up in stories.
Tiny thing maybe to add to this, what we haven't really in our list, because for the type of work we do, it's not necessarily that frequently required, is content designers, so copywriters.
Oh, yeah.
But dependent on your project, if you're doing brochure websites, you will certainly have a copywriter with you. That person would kind of sit at the same level.
Okay, so moving on, I think we're going to talk about sort of the more technical side of things. So tech lead or architect is something you always find usually on a delivery team. So how many of these you have? Well, it's probably either one per geographic location, or it's really one per like discrete feature delivery team that you have, right? And their responsibility is to interface with the client architects and really come up with a technical solution, right? So they need to architect the solution, They're responsible for keeping things consistent in the team, making sure the quality is high, things like test coverage is high, being the go-to people that like understand the overall system design. So if somebody has a question about how the overall thing's architected or a decision needs to be made technically, it's tech leads that do that.
I mean, they're the guardians of best practice in terms of technology, right? And I think what we find, the teams we work with, is that these architects, or tech leads as we prefer to call them, are still hands-on developing code. Right. So it's not, I think there's sometimes in the industry this concept that you become an architect and you just design architecture and then hand it over to developers who actually implement that architecture. And we believe that really good software results from these architects in quotation marks, that they are still hands-on involved in producing the solution.
Yeah. So you bring them in up front to understand the business need.
Yes.
They then hear the business need and can interpret that into a technical implementation, right?
And they
try to meet the business.
But are then part of the development team, right? They're not like separated, sitting outside this the day-to-day delivery of the project. They're hands-on.
Yeah. Hopefully they're coding a lot of times. Sometimes they don't get a lot of time to code because they're in meeting a lot of times. So you see that, and so we might have to talk about some of that stuff when we get in the tech lead thing. The only other thing I'll say too is that also, a tech lead might be a role within a team, but quite often you actually have developers within a team who play the tech lead role for a feature, right? So they might be the specialist in that feature, and they're the ones that come up with the design. They might run it across the other tech leads, or have to liaise with the product teams.
Correct.
So it's a fluid role, and really you want to upskill everybody in your team to be a tech lead.
I think
really.
That's maybe a really good point to generally say about all these roles. While we're talking about roles, I think sometimes these roles are more hats people put on to a certain degree. I mean, I would never code, but I know that I have done a little bit of thinking around delivery management, and I'm 100% sure that you've also done thinking around requirements in certain parts, right? So these roles they're not boxes you put people in and then they can't get out of the box. I think they're like, things that need to be there in terms of skills and capabilities on a team, but individuals sometimes map across these, or the boundaries blur.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Okay, the next one is just peer developer. So this is people putting hands on code, implementing a solution. They're responsible again for quality, understanding the implementation of how a business need is going to be met. They're the ones that are actually writing things, testing things, pushing things into production. How many you have on a team is sort of like, it depends on the size of your project, right? So that's usually the scalable thing. Typically in our teams we count them in pairs. So like if you do pair programming, typically you count them in pairs. That's not a hard and fast, but usually you have two people. The other good reason to have pairs is because of the whole knowledge sharing thing. So even if they're not working in pairs, actually sitting side by side, working on the same piece of code, they might be working on the same feature, but at least two people are synced up. And so, in case one person goes on holiday or leaves, there's two people that understand things. So a lot of times we think in pairs when we talk about developers.
And I think just to build the pyramid up, so you say working in pairs, and then maybe 2 to 3, 4 pairs maximum are a Scrum team. That's like your feature team. That's your 6 to 8 people. They're supported by, as we said, a business analyst, UX person, and a Scrum master in that. And then you combine multiple of those teams to a project and multiple projects to a program.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool.
So moving on, quality assurance or a tester. A QA quality assurance. And there's usually one of these for every 2 to 3 pairs you have on a team. It really depends, again, about throughput, how complex the things are they're testing. And what their job is really is to make sure the quality of the product going out meets the requirements that were set out in the business analysis stage, right? So they're the ones actually going through all the scenarios, making sure to test it. And they'll do that a number of ways. They'll write automated testing, and that's really important for continuous delivery to have solid automated testing.
Yes.
That's maybe more of the integration or higher level, whereas like the developers might write unit tests. The quality assurance person is going to write more integration or smoke testing. They might get involved with cross-browser testing and automating that, or performance testing.
Penetration testing, all those specialist testing scenarios.
There's all sorts of specialist things. But ultimately, they're sort of the gate to make sure the story written is done correctly, throw it back or raise bugs if there's an issue with it. and then they're kind of the final sign off before the product owner gets to sign the story off and it goes into production. So
I think they're kind of, if you look at this, the counterpart to the product people, right? So the product people say what they want, the technical people implement, and the quality assurance people, they make sure that what was implemented meets those requirements in the first place, right? And that forms the kind of end-to-end cycle really of your delivery.
One final thing I wanted to say about QAs is that often, although we said there's kind of like one QA for 2 to 3 dev pairs, really quite often what happens is during crunch time, so you have a deadline at the first of the month, all the developers are writing code like crazy, and eventually developer pairs might split, and the pairs themselves might just be working on one story each, and they'll just be producing a huge amount of output, to try to meet that deadline, the Friday before it's due. But then, of course, the QAs don't have time to then check it. So quite often, that whole ratio gets blown up, and you need to draft devs into the QA.
So they cross QA.
So they do cross QA.
Yes.
So again, like you said, like all these roles, there's a lot of crossover and different things. Sometimes dev have to be like QAs, as long as they wear that different hat and they sort of look at it from a different point of view. That's really the important thing.
Yep.
So finally, I guess we could talk about DevOps or infrastructure or sysadmins. I think DevOps is probably the term that's mostly used. And these people are the people who are coding infrastructure. So quite often these days, you have things working in the cloud, cloud-based solutions, or even if there's physical servers they're working on, there are virtual machines that are being spun up and whatnot. And these are the people who are writing the infrastructure as code and supporting the actual server side of things. But that's there's a huge gamut of things. So this is stuff like domain name management, secrets management, Kubernetes, virtual machine, resource allocation, creating pipelines to push code out. It is really a super broad topic. And how many of these do you have on a project? Probably as many as you can get, I think. It's hard to find them. It's hard to find good ones. And when you find the more sort of DevOps time that you get, usually the more efficient you can make the rest of the development team, because you can do things like make the development pipeline more streamlined, faster, more automated. So DevOps are really important to have. And again, sometimes you have devs that play that role within the team.
This is an interesting one, because I think this is quite contentious in the industry, whether DevOps should actually be a separate role or whether the developers, some of our colleagues would insist that the DevOps jobs, so providing the tooling like pipelines, etc., should be created and provided and maintained by the developers themselves, hence the concatenation of dev and operations ops. Yeah. But in practice, as again, with a lot of these roles, while maybe one individual can do all of this, they in practice just don't have the time. So therefore, you have specialists who focus on one aspect or the other. But I think it is important to say that if you have a DevOps or multiple DevOps specialists on your teams, they need to be working really, really closely and directly with your developers, right? They're not sitting in a separate room or even on a separate desk. And they need to be
integrated in the team.
Absolutely.
They're part of the team, integrated. They shouldn't be in another space working on something completely different. They need to be integrated with that team, understand the problem, they're a team member just like everybody else.
I think we'll do quite a number of podcasts maybe on DevOps and Dev specifically, because I think it is such a big thing in the industry and it's so easy to get this wrong. So going forwards, we'll talk about this. So if we look at the team structure we just described, what is interesting is that I have worked recently on a project which was exactly that team structure in its minimum. So we were 7 people working with a client delivering a project, and then even more recently, I've worked on a project with you where we were at our peak point maybe 40 people, where we had multiple of those roles. So as you said before, it really, really depends on what your client and project requirements are, how big this thing scales up. And we've seen this, we work with government clients sometimes, where you see teams of like 200, 250 strong being made up ultimately of this fabric, really.
Right. And a lot of that is budget constraints and all that will come into play when you're starting to put together a team. But you really want to keep this sort of mix in mind of having these roles staffed by somebody, and then continuously review them to make sure, okay, wait, is one of these roles a bottleneck? Are all your stories being pooled in QA because you only have one QA and you have 20 developers? Well, you know what? Time to get another QA, right? So, so that's really important.
Todd, sorry, we haven't spoken in detail about the roles in the client side. So, of course, there are more roles on a project. This is not everything. There are subject matter experts and there is your users, etc., etc. I guess we'll talk about them in a different
different series, I think.
Right?
Yeah, so I think, so this series is going to be more about the delivery team roles themselves.
Fine.
So I think that's it for an overview. So I think our first episode on this series about delivery of roles is going to be about business analysis and product ownership, right?
Yes, I have spoken last week with our colleague Swati Podar while we were in Bangalore about that role. So you can expect something really interesting to hear about product ownership and business analysis.
Great.
Cool. Thank you for listening, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
That's it for today's episode. Have a look at our show notes with related information and details on how to get in touch at theburnup.com. We are listener driven, so please do send us your questions, comments, and ideas for new episodes.
We're both practitioners and are happy to discuss interesting opportunities from consulting to coaching to getting involved in actual projects. For inquiries, please visit burnupmedia.com. This podcast is produced by Burnup Media Limited under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 license, which means you can share it as long as you give credit, but you cannot change it or make money of it.
Until next time, thanks again for listening and have a wonderful day.